Okay, we have this table of data in Google Sheets and we're going to look at it in different ways. What we're going to do, we zoom out a little bit here, is analyze it using the query function, and then we're going to look at it with one of these four functions, depending on what we're trying to do. So the point of doing this is to help you understand what these different functions do and when you may want to choose one over the other. All right, we're just going to start out with a simple sort. We want to take this table and we want to return it, sort it by the item. So to do that using the query function, you hit the equal sign because you're starting to type a formula, and we type out query. And the data that we're going to use will be A1 through D13. So pay special attention that I did select row 1. That's where the header is, and I did that on purpose. And so for this query, we're going to use the word select. So that's just specifying what we want to get from the table and return below. We'll say everything, so we'll use a star. But to sort it, we're going to use the word order by. So as I'm typing this out, you're probably realizing that this isn't your standard syntax for a spreadsheet function, right? When we get over to the right and we're doing those will be just a parentheses, a range, a comma, more what you're used to. But these words, select and order by, come from the SQL language. And they're very powerful, but they're not familiar. So we'll talk through them as we use them. The order by, we want to sort it by column D. So we'll specify that column. I could say COL4, or since this is in the same sheet, I can just say D. And we need to remember to close these instructions off with another double quote. And then the last argument is headers. So if you just give it a 1, that's the same as the default. And that's saying, hey, one of these rows is a header, so treat it as such. We'll leave it as a 1. When we do this below, we can just leave the 1 off for simplicity. But I want to put it there just so we can talk about it. And if I hit enter, I realize that I want to sort them by A, not D. So let me go back. We order them by A, hit enter, and there we go. So the header's not sorted, right? Even though it starts with an I, it's not below H. But the rest of these are in alphabetical order, and the other columns stayed with the right row, right? So the hammers, there are 7 cases of them. If you come up here, hammers, 7 cases. So it sorted all 4 columns. And so we'll come over to the right, and the one thing that we talked about is these 4 functions don't really recognize a header row. So we're going to need to grab that, copy it, and paste it. I suppose one advantage of that is you can get the formatting right, so it came over as bold. But the disadvantage of that is that every time you use one of these, you have to remember to copy and paste the headers. So we'll come down one below, and to do a sort, we'll just use the filter function called sort and give it this range. So we'll start below the header. All right, A2 to D13, and that's all we need. The default is to sort by the first column, so we need to do nothing more. If we go back into here, you can see that you can specify the sort column, and you can specify whether or not it's ascending or descending. Let's hit enter, and it returns exactly what the query function did. And if you look at this function, it's a lot more simple than the query function, right? The query function is over here. It has all of that. And that will change as we go through these, but the first one, the simple one, is easier not to use query. All right, so our second example, what we want to do is just return values that match certain words. So in this case, we're going to return rows that have the word north in the warehouse column. So for the query function, we'll type out query again. We will give it the data range, including the header. Always do our select clause. In this case, we want to look at and return all of the columns where, so that's how you actually, I realized that I left off the double quotes. So we'll put that back in. All right, where, and we can say uppercase D for the column equals, and almost just did a double quote there again because the word north is a string, but you already have the entire SQL instruction in double quotes. So let's use a single quote. And we'll say north. Make sure you get the capitalization right. And we should be done with that. So we'll use a double quote to specify that we're done. And we don't need to talk about the header or put the 1 there because that's the default. Let's hit enter. And it returned only the lines that have a north. So this hammer, 7 cases of them, just aren't here. So to do the same thing with the filter functions, let's copy and paste the header. And then we'll just use the function called filter. It needs a range, so we will say A2 to D13. And then it needs a condition. So the condition, I think, is actually a little bit trickier to write out than it would be for query once you know the query language, because you have to use the entire range. So instead of saying where column D is equal to north, we need to say where D2 through D13 is equal to north. Not the end of the world, but just a little bit more to remember, a little bit more typing. Let's say we're done with that. We'll close it off, hit enter. And again, it's the exact same output, but done a different way. So we'll look at the size of these functions. We'll give it the weight test. This one isn't too bad. It's getting a little bit larger. If you come over to query, it's actually still more complicated probably than using the filter function, but arguably a little bit easier to read. We're just selecting everything where D equals north. You can always just say that like a sentence. But when you look at this one, it has these ranges equal to north, right? Neither of them are that bad. We will go down to example 3. And here we want to return values that are less than a certain amount, but we're actually going to calculate the amount. So if you look up here, you have cases and amounts per case. You multiply those two together to get a total. So we're going to return values here where the total is less than 140. So we will say query again. This is all the same. And return all of the columns where, and here again is where the query function I think is a little bit easier to read. We're just going to say B, so column B times C is less than 140. That's the end of what we want to do. We'll use a double quote and we're done. All right, so you have to do a little bit of math to make sure this is right, but these are all less than 140. Let's take a bigger looking one and do the multiplication. 120. All right, so that worked. It returns 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines. And now we're going to do this with the, we'll use the filter function again. And we're going to say equals filter, same range. And our condition takes a little bit more thought here. So we can't specify just one column at a time like we do with the query language. We have to specify ranges of equal height, so the equal number of rows, as the range, the D2 through D13. So we will say B2 through B13 times C2 through C13. Now I think at this point it gets a little bit confusing because it looks like you're multiplying this entire range by this range, but you're not. It's iterating through each one and testing it. So the way that this is written is confusing, but it's really saying B2 times C2 and then testing it against this criteria, 7 times 15, etc. So what we'll do, those two ranges are less than 140. We're done here. Let's close it off. And it returns the same thing as a query function. And I think by this point, we can fairly say that it's harder to read. All right, so I'll double click in here. You can tell what it's doing, but it takes a lot more sort of squinting and looking at it sideways. At least it does for me. We go over to the query function, and it's just saying where b times c is less than 140, right? Now we're going to definitely crank it up a notch, and I think we'll tip the scale as to where the query function is clearly better for these more complicated applications. What we're going to do here is we're going to add a calculated field with a label, and then we'll come down below and filter it. So I'm actually going to copy and paste this query function because they are kind of hard to get right on your first shot. There's nothing wrong with using the resources at your disposal, right? I went and copied that from the template. You can get access to this template too if you look in the description. There'll be a link to it. And if you want to learn more about the query function, I'll also put a link to that as well. It's on a sister site, sheetshelp.com, where there's some more concise tutorials just on Google Sheets at that site. But we have one on the query function, and these examples are very similar there, and they're all described in a web page. But let's look at the query function. So we're picking the range, that's the same, but now we're selecting and returning column A, B, and C. So that's the same. But then the last column we're saying is B times C. All right, so we're doing multiplication here and replacing the warehouse column with the total amount column, and we're going to label B times C total. All right, so if I hit escape, you may have seen this while I was talking, but we have this new column here that's created completely by the query function, and it's returning the total number of cases. All right, so the best way I could come up with to do this in Google Sheets without the query function is from a combination of different techniques. But some of this is going to be the same. So we want the header. We'll put the header in here. Well, let's change this part of the header to the word total. And then this part of the table, we just want to return intact. So let's just, there's lots of different ways to do that, but we'll just use filter. We'll grab the range, but we won't go all the way over to the right. And we'll make the condition just where they're not blank. We'll say is blank A2 to A13 equal to false. So that's just that they have content in them. We return those three columns, so we're at the point where we have this now. Well, we can use the array formula, and we can multiply this range by the amount per case. Close this off, and then it will run multiplication for every row for these two ranges. All right, so as long as they're the same size, it'll run right down here, do it for every row. And that way you don't have to repeat the multiplication function for every single one of these rows. It's all being written from the formula in I-58. All right, so we got that done, but it was not as elegant as the query function. So we had the filter function, and we had the array formula. It all could have been done from this query. Let's make this even more simple. We can take the 1 off the end. Make that nice and tight. All right, let's go down to the next function. This will be another one where we're showing that the query function is easier. We'll go up, grab that query function again, because we're going to add a calculated labeled column like we did last time. But then we want to add a filter. So we will paste this here. In order to get this query function to not shift the range down, let's just copy the actual text of the function itself. Oh, and I'm getting an error because it's going to, if I don't put the filter on it, it's going to overwrite this text that's in A81. So let's go ahead and add the filter now. So we'll go into this query. We'll go after the select clause and before the label. So these clauses have to be in a particular order. There's more on that in the link in the description for the query function. over at Sheets Help, but we will add the where clause here. So instead of using the word filter, we're just saying where, and it makes sense if you say it out loud, where B times C is less than 140. Hit enter. If you look, all of these are less than 140. Grab some formatting. I want to scroll down a little bit to get screen cleaner. There we go. And in order to do that with the filter functions, let's get the header again. We'll go up and copy what we had from before. We'll come down and paste it. It's going to get mad at us and give us the error that it can't write it out because I don't have the filter on it yet, so it would overwrite this text in F81. So let's add this where it's not blank, and then we'll do a comma. If you look at the help area there, you can do a condition 2 and more if you want, but it's in brackets saying that it's optional, but we want to do it. And we want the range of B2 to B13 times the range of C2 to C13 is less than 140. All right, so the exact same output. All right, so we're getting there. One, we need to fix this tricky formatting, and we can do the array formula again. Select it with my mouse now to make it a little bit faster. Close it off. Now we have the exact same output as a query function. And adding that filter in, if you look at the query function, you can still read it. Selected and outputted these columns where B times C is less than 140 and labeled it total. You can literally read it like a sentence. If you look in the filter function, not so much. You could work your way through that, but it's harder to read. Now we're going to use the query function to sort the output, but also limit the output. So let's type out the query. Bonus points if you can figure out what filter function I'm going to use to be similar to this. We'll get there in a minute. I'm going to go back to taking all the columns and returning them. But now we want to order by, which is a SQL way of saying sort. Well, let's say column C, shall we? We'll do that descending. But we're going to limit the output to 5 rows. All right, we'll close that off with the parentheses, hit enter. And there we go. So this is ordered by column C. So you have 18, it goes down to 15. It's ordered or sorted by column C, so they're in numerical order going down or descending. And there's only 5 of them. So to do this with a more traditional spreadsheet formula, you would use one that's called SORTN. And the way to remember that name is that it sorts it, but it only sorts in numbers. So you specify how many for it to return. Going to need to put the header in here, so I'll have to go back and do that, but we'll sort A2 through D13. And now N is going to be 5, so that's how many you want to return. And then there's just an interesting parameter here called display ties mode. I want to show all of the ties, but there's some methodology that you can specify where if there is a tie and there's 3 of them, is that 1 item or is that 3 items? And do I cut it off if there's ties in the 5th row, or do I show them all? Let's just use it as a 0 for now. You can read more about the SORTN function. I'll put it in the description. We're going to sort it on here. You have to say column 3. In the query function, you would say C. And I don't want it ascending. I want it descending, so that would be false here. All right, we'll close that off with the parentheses, hit enter. And this is the same, although it looks weird because these functions don't handle the header. So that kind of Comes back to haunt you sometimes, as you just saw. So I'll grab the header actually from up here, paste it, and then I'll fix this formatting. And now you can see these outputs are the exact same. Query function is medium long. It's easy to read. The SORTN function is near impossible to read, but if you click through it, you can kind of understand it. So SORTN can be really handy to use in different situations, but especially if you don't know how to use a query function, because it looks and feels like filter and sort and unique. So if you don't know the query function, SORTN can be very handy. Last thing we're going to do is remove duplicates. So this is something that's actually not native to query language. You can make it happen, but it takes a little bit more work. And I'm just going to grab it from work that I've already done, paste the formula in here, and we'll talk about it. So let's look at the select clause. You always have to use that. We're just going to return A, which is the items, and the maximum of B. So using the spreadsheet function called max, which picks only one value, and it will pick the largest value. And then we're going to say group it by A. So that's our way of taking duplicates out, is by just aggregating each one of these. So you can put all the wrenches together, and you're going to just return the maximum number of cases for wrench. All right, because you kind of have to pick something. You could sum them, you could count them. We're just going to do max, and just with the theory that, hey, you need to discard the duplicates, you have to keep something. So we'll just keep the maximum amount. We'll hit return and get this nice tidy little table here. Now, if you want to use one of the filter family functions to remove duplicates, there's one with that ability built in. It can be a little wonky to work with, though, as I discovered when I was putting this together, and we'll talk about what happens. So you can just run it as unique, specify the range, close out the parentheses, and it returns the entire list. So what's happening here, if you look, there's 12 items, and I know there's 12 up here. Because the unique function, if you want to return the entire range, needs to have the entire row match. So although there's more than one instance of a wrench, let's say down here, it doesn't also have 11 cases, 12 per case, and in the north warehouse. So all of the columns have to match for the unique function to work. It can still be really handy if that's what you're trying to do, but in this case, that's not what we want. At least not what I envisioned. Imagine wrench being returned in one line. So because this is the last example and we're that crazy, we're going to break out of the mold of picking from the filter functions, and we will just select this to try to get to something like what the query function did. And we'll just go to data cleanup, and we can remove duplicates this way. And this is a little bit more powerful. So the columns to analyze, we said we just wanted to look at the items. So let's back up one. It does recognize, or I can tell it that it has a header row, which is great because then it read it and it's telling me the labels for all these other rows. Plus it's not going to try to remove it. But I don't want to select all the columns. I want to take that check mark off and just do item. So if I click on remove duplicates here, it removes 6 and left 6. Let's move this down a little bit before we use it. It was acting strangely when I was testing it, so we'll put it here. Data cleanup, remove duplicates. And I don't know why that's not working, so I will show you the return from when I was practicing. And it's nice and cleaned up here. That's what that function should do. I'm guessing it usually does it, but it wouldn't do it for me. So if you like comparing different capabilities to get a better understanding of how to work with spreadsheets, in this next video, we're going to create a pivot table in Google Sheets and compare it to creating a pivot table in Excel. So they're both very powerful programs, but they work differently, and you can sit back, relax, and watch this video as we talk about all those differences. Thanks for watching. It's nice to have you along.